Okay, I'm going to get started. Welcome to the first virtual history of 2022. This is Nathan Denny's Associate Director of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. First, a big thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. Thanks to your support, Baltimore Heritage and BAF have been able to host over 70 virtual histories since we started this program in April of 2020. We're glad to be able to continue hosting these programs for free. And this year, we'll be moving to a bi-weekly schedule. So don't tune in next week, but the week after, I hope you will join us for a presentation on Baltimore slave markets with Richard Messick. But today we are joined by Alexander Lothstein, the Museum Learning Manager and Associate Curator at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. He received his bachelor's degree in history from Ohio Wesleyan University in 2015 and his master's degree in history from Temple University in 2017. He has been at MCHC since 2017 and curates exhibitions. It manages all on-site education programs, development, and interpretation. His content specialties are the American Revolution to the early Republic era and the Civil Rights Movement in Maryland. Before I turn it over to Alex, if you have any questions, please use the chat box and the Q&A box. And with that, take it away, Alex.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, well, I want to thank you for the introduction, Nathan, and I'd like to thank the American Institute of Architects Baltimore chapter and Baltimore Heritage for inviting me to speak. My name is Alex Lothstein, and I am the Museum Learning Manager and Associate Curator at the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We're located in the Mount Vernon district of Baltimore. So I want to start by looking at an image like this. We see images of like this of boarded up homes in primarily Black, poor, and low-income neighborhoods in Baltimore. This image is from West Mulberry Street and North Gilmore Street. And there's a tendency to think, to immediately think about poverty, lack of care in keeping up the homes, the show The Wire, and other negative stereotypes. Yet these neighborhoods did not always have boarded up homes or these negative connotations. In fact, Old West Baltimore, where this image is from, was a thriving center of Black culture in Baltimore. Nevertheless, the current state of housing in West and East Baltimore, primarily Black neighborhoods, is a result of decades of local and national housing discriminatory policies targeting Black Baltimoreans. This presentation is going to explore housing discrimination in Baltimore and the moments where activists try to challenge housing discrimination. But in order to understand housing segregation in Baltimore, it's necessary to go back to the Civil War. In 1860, Baltimore had the largest free Black population of any city below the Mason-Dixon line, with about 25,680 free Black Baltimoreans living in the city. After the Civil War, Baltimore experienced a migration of newly free Black Baltimoreans moving into the city. Housing in Baltimore was fairly mixed at the time. During and after the Civil War, white and Black residents tended to live amongst each other, with white Baltimoreans tending to live on main streets, while Black Baltimoreans tended to live along the alleyways. But four factors would change the dynamic of housing in Baltimore. These factors, and in no specific order, were first, the industrialization of downtown Baltimore. New factories filled the air in Baltimore with smog, smoke, and the sound and smells of factories. Downtown Baltimore became a very unpleasant place for many to live. Second, there was an increase in European immigration on top of the migration of free Black Baltimoreans. Baltimore became a fairly crowded city with Black Baltimoreans and immigrants living in slum conditions like you see here. Third was the Great Baltimore Fire of 1904. The Great Baltimore Fire ripped through downtown Baltimore, destroying thousands of businesses and homes. And while the city did rebuild by 1906, it led many in the city who could to look outside of the city or outside of directly downtown for new places to live. And the fourth and final was the emergence of new public transportation options within the city. Streetcars like the one you see here allowed people to live farther outside of downtown, but still work within the city. And so as white Baltimoreans began to move out of downtown Baltimore, followed by ethnic groups such as Jewish immigrants and European immigrants, there were no official housing segregation policies put in place that stopped wealthy and middle-class Black Baltimoreans from following the same trajectory. Nevertheless, most realtors did not sell to Black Baltimoreans or Black families. If a Black family bought a house in a white neighborhood, the white property owner most likely sold it to them themselves. And this is what actually happened in 1910 with the purchase of 1834 McCullough Street by W. Ashby Hawkins. Hawkins, the individual with the red circle around him, was a prominent Black attorney who bought a home in a predominantly white neighborhood of West Baltimore. Hawkins then subsequently rented this home to his law partner, George McMecken, who you can see on the right. The sale broke the color barrier of the 1800 block of McCullough Street, but the subsequent rental to his law partner, McMecken, led to white backlash and began a series of official and unofficial housing discrimination policies within Baltimore. White Baltimoreans and government officials began using housing ordinances, homeowners associations, and blockbusting to discriminate against and segregate and take advantage of Black Baltimoreans. And unofficially, this sale began a pattern of selling in which white Baltimoreans would sell to Jewish homebuyers, who would then, and only if their neighborhood or block's market was in a slum, would sell to Black Baltimoreans. And once the block was broken, many homeowners would then freely sell to Black homebuyers or renters. And although this line of succession primarily took place in Old West Baltimore neighborhoods of Upton and Druid Heights, where that red square is, this block breaking and anti-Black press pushed out by newspapers scared white homeowners and government officials throughout Baltimore. Generally, blocks would be mixed for a little while, but blockbusters, aided by newspaper articles, targeted white and Jewish homeowners, stating that their home costs would go down and crime would go up, as you can see in these newspaper reports. For example, in the bottom left newspaper, the caption is, "Where the Negro invasion has precipitated values." It is worth noting that a lot of the crime individuals were concerned about was actually white homeowners stoning or damaging Black homeowners' houses, as seen in the articles relating to George McMecken's home on the right and the general headline that you see in the top left. And once the white or Jewish resident agreed to sell, blockbusters offered low prices, in a sense, acting as speculators. But I do want to clarify, it is worth noting that when referring to blockbusters, this doesn't refer to the families that moved in, primarily the Black families that moved in, but it actually refers to corporations and individual speculators who sought to take advantage of the fear of Black families moving into white neighborhoods. White sellers would sell, and then these blockbusters would generally sell much higher to Black home buyers, or they would split a unit up into apartments with either very high rent or with a lot of families in the apartments, in a sense becoming landlords, but what some would also argue would be slumlords. And while violence against Black families moving into white neighborhoods occurred openly, some neighborhoods did take different paths. As you can see by this news article from 1910, the Huntington Association sought to restrict Black Baltimoreans from moving into their neighborhood in a, quote, friendly way. Despite this article highlighting the segregation, it highlights the conditions of the Black community. The Huntington community wanted to improve the streets in Black neighborhoods for Black residents, so these residents wouldn't want to move into Huntington. And this indicates to us that the streets were in Black neighborhoods were of lesser quality than those in white neighborhoods, further indicating that the government was limiting the resources to the Black communities. And following Hawkins buying and McMecken moving into the home on McCullough Street, white city officials became fearful of the upward mobility of Black families. They began enacting policies to curb this upward movement and attempts at Black families buying homes. And one of the first official policies was Baltimore City Ordinance 610, also called the West Plan, named after Councilman Samuel West. This ordinance stated that no Black resident could move into a block in which more than half of the residents were white and vice versa. It also stated that existing conditions would not be disturbed and no one would be forced to move out of their neighborhood. This ordinance was the first of three, but had the largest impact as many Southern cities began to replicate the, quote, Baltimore idea. And the Baltimore idea led to many crowded Black neighborhoods within Baltimore City. And not surprisingly, the passage of Ordinance 610, the West Plan, angered Black Baltimoreans. As seen by this article, Black leaders worried that, quote, the passage of the ordinance would hinder greatly the progress of the race and that nothing should be done to hinder the race, end quote. And today, many economists would argue that restrictions like the West Plan and the resulting blockbusting did in fact hinder the ability for many in the Black community of Baltimore and throughout the United States to build generational wealth. Ordinance 610 was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1917 in Buchanan v. Worley, a similar case that came out of Kentucky. And the case ruled that the statute of 1866, originally passed under sanction of the 13th Amendment and practically reenacted after the adoption of the 14th Amendment, expressly provided that all citizens of the United States in any state shall have the same right to purchase property as is enjoyed by white citizens. Colored persons are citizens of the United States and have the right to purchase property and enjoy and use the same without laws discriminating against them solely on account of color. Despite Ordinance 610 being found unconstitutional, it became baked into the Baltimore real estate market and created lasting effects. Some of these we're going to explore later. But it wasn't just government housing ordinances that restricted Black Baltimoreans from this upward mobility, but also private homeowner associations. As white upper and middle class families began to move out of the city, companies like the Roland Park Company began developing communities for specifically these families. Before buying a home, residents had to agree to a pamphlet of rules, sometimes referred to as a neighborhood covenant. And one of the rules that actually comes out of this covenant that you see right here it's for the Guilford neighborhood, and it's in 1913. And under the nuisance section, which also includes sections on smoke and tanning of animals, stated that, quote, at no time shall the land included in said tract or any part thereof or any building erected thereon be occupied by any Negro or person of Negro extraction. Yet there was an exception to this rule. The prohibition, quote, the prohibition, however, is not intended to include the occupancy by a Negro domestic servant or other person while employed in or about the premises by the owner or occupant of any land included in said tract, end quote. So according to the Roland Park Company, Black families were not allowed to live in the Guilford neighborhood, but live-in Black domestic servants were perfectly fine. It's also worth noting that many covenants also excluded Jewish immigrants and other immigrant families. For many Black families, covenants and housing ordinances forced them into neighborhoods that suffer from unequal resources and investment. And in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelley v. Kramer that private restrictive covenants were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment. Yet, like the government ordinances, these had lasting effects and helped cement the idea in Baltimore of white neighborhoods or white parts of town and Black neighborhoods and Black parts of town. And segregation from private neighborhoods began before the West Plan was implemented. And in response to the creation of these private white neighborhoods, specifically the Roland Park neighborhood, Black activists, lawyers, and construction and realty companies began developing specific neighborhoods for middle-class Black Baltimoreans. And one specific neighborhood was the Cherry Heights neighborhood, which interestingly was represented legally by Hawkins and McMecken, who purchased the home on McCullough Street. Cherry Heights was touted as having, quote, as having lots, quote, equal to Roland Park in beauty, which Roland Park was the white-only neighborhood, was one of the wealthiest white-only neighborhoods in Baltimore. And as you can see by the article on the right from the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, the lack of housing opportunities was a constant source of frustration for the Black community, but the opening of the Cherry Heights neighborhood by an all-Black company created a buzz and excitement in the Black community of Baltimore. Despite Ordinance 610 being found unconstitutional in 1917, the effects of Ordinance 610 and the discriminatory housing covenants are seen in this 1937 residential security map that was published by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC was a government-sponsored corporation created as part of the New Deal. And its goal was good at first. Its goal was to refinance home mortgages that were in default to prevent foreclosures. They also sought to expand home buying opportunities. But instead, the HOLC became a tool of government racial segregation and became the creator of redlining. The HOLC created residential security maps of cities with the goal of assessing the creditworthiness of neighborhoods and the lending risk and desirability of these neighborhoods. And this HOLC map of Baltimore shows the city with this grading. Green or grade A areas were the most desirable, blue or grade B were next, followed by yellow or grade C, and the least desirable were red or grade D neighborhoods. While white neighborhoods tended to be grade A or B, Black neighborhoods were almost all redlined. Redlining showed a bias against Black Marylanders and immigrants. For example, one neighborhood that was listed as having nice transportation and was in a central location was graded D for two reasons. The first was the obsolescence of housing, but the second had, quote, an increasing Negro concentration, end quote. Using these maps, mortgage lenders were able to reject loans for purchasing houses in redline communities. They were able to limit the amount of funding going to these communities, and they were able to stop Black Marylanders and immigrants from building wealth and moving out to other regions. And when compared to a map of poverty in Baltimore from 2012, you can see the long-term effects of the HOLC maps, where redlined areas have very high poverty today and blue and green areas of Baltimore have lower poverty. The effects of the 1937 redlining policy on Baltimore were expanded upon during World War II. As the country geared up for war, wartime industries in Baltimore, such as Glen L. Martin Aircraft and Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard, required immense amount of workers. And as a result, Baltimore's population increased rapidly in the early mid-20th century. Ship and airplane production provided opportunities during World War II, though jobs and housing were not equally available to all. Many wartime factories only hired Black employees when forced to by the federal government, and even then, as in the case of Glen L. Martin Aviation, they created a segregated factory away from the primary plant. The segregation continued into housing, and while the Glen L. Martin factory brought in trailer homes, built dormitories, and built around 2,000 temporary and later permanent houses, like you can see in this image, the housing was only for white defense workers. In a 1941 Baltimore Sun article, the only available housing for Black defense workers were at the Poe Home projects, but that only housed around 300 people. And according to the article, the McCullough homes were to be completed soon, but nevertheless, housing for Black Marylanders and defense workers was, quote, overcrowded to the point where it's almost impossible to secure living quarters of even the most primitive type. And it's worth noting that when this is happening, the country is at war, and Black individuals are moving into the city to help support the war. And so these families are moving to work in factories, build ships, build planes that are going to help win a war against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And this map, which was graciously passed on to me by the Friends of Maryland Olmsted Parks and Landscapes, shows the housing situation in downtown Baltimore as of July 1st, 1941. And it might be a little bit hard to see, but the blocks colored orange indicate white housing projects, while those that are blue indicate Black housing projects. And so the Black housing projects were going to be the Douglas homes, the McCullough homes, the Poe homes, and the Gilmore homes. The white were going to be the Latrobe and the Perkins homes. And as you can see, there are a lot more Black housing in the city. But as I show in a later slide, you'll see that this didn't really affect the housing situation for Black Baltimoreans. And so you can see that there are multiple houses, but it is worth noting that many of these projects are not built yet at this time. They are still planned, or they're in the process of being built. But as the war progressed and more workers flooded into the city required more housing for Black defense workers. And with the overcrowding of wartime housing, Maryland and the federal government began to look for locations to build Black wartime housing. And one of the first suggestions was to build this housing near Herring Run in Northeast Baltimore. But this plan fell through as protests by white Baltimoreans living in the area caused the project to be abandoned. In response, developers began to look towards other areas to build defense worker housing. And one area that was chosen was the Cherry Hill neighborhood of Baltimore. But just like Herring Run, white neighbors put up a fight against the development of this neighborhood. And interestingly, though, it wasn't just white workers who were protesting against Cherry Hill. It was also the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Yet, unlike white protesters, the NAACP was protesting the cost of the neighborhood. From their perspective, taxpayers could save money if the federal government and the factories integrated their housing rather than requiring taxpayers to pay for new segregated housing. And the NAACP was not wrong in their estimate. According to a report from March of 1945 by the Housing Authority of Baltimore, which was also shared to me by Friends of Maryland Olmsted Parks and Landscapes, segregated Black and white housing cost the city over $26 million in development cost, with a valuation cost of only a little bit over $14 million. Cherry Hill itself cost over $3.5 million to develop. And it's worth noting when looking at the valuation of the properties, the white properties are valued at $2,372,428 more than Black project homes, despite the fact that there are 6 Black project homes for defense workers and only 3 project homes for white defense workers. Furthermore, in total, the white projects held 1,280 people more than Black projects. Again, despite the fact that there are 6 projects for Black families and 3 for white. So you can see that there's already a discriminatory aspect in the evaluation of the homes, where they're located, and also the size and how many people they can hold. And so despite the protests from white Baltimoreans and the NAACP obviously protesting over different issues, the federal government went ahead with the building between 600 and 700 permanent houses for Black defense workers. Issues during the building and the final planning worried some in the Black community. And I should note this is Cherry Hill. One of the issues revolved around the builders of the community. In a 1944 article from the Afro-American newspaper, the contractor laying bricks for a segregated Black community refused to hire Black bricklayers. And as they were planning the community, individuals from the community objected to certain features of Cherry Hill. Some of the major issues were making sure that the marshland was removed, making sure there was a school, stores, and transportation. And one of the most interesting was making sure the city garbage incinerator would not spread odor throughout the community. But interestingly enough, this is still an issue that faces Cherry Hill and Westport communities today, which are 2 predominantly Black communities. These communities are just south of the city's incinerator and face what some deem as environmental racism from the odors coming from the incinerator, as well as the lasting health effects from living south of the incinerator. Despite Cherry Hill and other communities being built, Black residents in Baltimore were still forced into tight housing. And this would create a problem when the city's population peaked less than a decade later. In 1950, Baltimore's population peaked at 949,708 people. For those in the planned neighborhoods of Roland Park and Guilford, the population peak didn't affect them greatly. Many of these individuals lived in who were mostly white, lived on quarter to half-acre lots in houses like the one you see on the screen. On the other hand, as the population peaked, many working-class Black Baltimoreans lived in conditions like these. Many of these neighborhoods were overcrowded, not taken care of by the city, or almost completely forgotten about by the city. And a lot of them were also falling apart. The city referred to these as slums, despite the fact that the city played a role in the creation of these conditions. And so to keep up with housing demand and to alleviate overcrowding in Black neighborhoods, the city of Baltimore began the clearance of, quote, slums in Baltimore. The city began to start replacing these slums with high-rise public housing developments, which were a national building and urban planning trend that emerged in the 1950s. These high-rise developments were sold as designed for the working class residents of the city, but for many Black Baltimoreans, these developments, including the Lafayette Courts, Flag House Courts, the Murphy Homes, and the Perkins Homes, were actually seen as tools of segregation rather than working class homes. And initially, these new homes represented an improvement from life in dilapidated slum housing, with many projects offering community programs, swimming pools, and other activity centers. However, between 1955 and 1990, Baltimore's high-rise developments suffered from disrepair and neglect from the city, a lack of continued investment from the city, and crime. Throughout the 1990s, Baltimore began demolishing the high-rises, beginning with Lafayette Courts in 1995, and in most cases, replacing them with mixed-income housing communities. Now, it is worth noting that not all predominantly white neighborhoods opposed Black families from moving in. In one case, the Ashburton neighborhood in Baltimore was covered in a Saturday Evening Post article regarding integration. And as you can see by this cover, in the first few sentences, the author and the neighborhood don't necessarily oppose Black individuals moving into their neighborhood as long as they are of the same socioeconomic class. What they do oppose, though, is the economic threat of white families, the economic pressure that the presence of Black families puts on the neighborhood. And so in response to the threat of white families moving away, the Ashburton neighborhood and the Neighborhood Association released this letter. As you can see, they understood that Black families would be moving into the neighborhood, though they weren't fully supportive of it, but were more against white families moving away in response. They then list out the reasons why families shouldn't move away. So some of the reasons are, it was still a nice neighborhood. There were no, quote, safe neighborhoods from Black families moving in, and the city will eventually address the, quote, problem. One of the most interesting points, though, is being, quote, from this letter, quote, and as we have said from the beginning, if most people remain in Ashburton and white families continue to buy, then we do not fear any large influx or major change, end quote. So the Ashburton neighborhood was okay with Black families moving in, but as you saw, they still preferred white families. And nevertheless, a major change would occur in the city and lead to larger white flight out of the city. While the city's population peaked in 1950, 1968 marked a changing point in Baltimore's population. On April 6, 1968, following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, many cities in the United States, including Baltimore, erupted in riots. And over the next 2 weeks, Baltimore was devastated by events that left 6 dead, dozens injured, and property damage around $12 million, and also required the deployment of the National Guard and the Army. Officially ending on April 14th, the 1968 Baltimore riots brought the anger of the Black community that had simmered for years to the forefront. And the events also exacerbated existing racial tensions within the city, sped up white flight, led to the militarization of Baltimore police, and the closing of many downtown businesses. This white flight can be seen in this graph, highlighting the populations of Baltimore City and Baltimore County, Baltimore City being the maroon color and Baltimore County being the yellowish color. And Baltimore County is where most people move to. And so between 1940 and 1980, you can see this large change in population. And while Black middle-class Baltimoreans who could also left the city, the migration was primarily white families. Yet with the exodus from the city also came the exodus of money. And as more people left the city, tax revenue declined, leading to a lack of government resources, diminishing of schools, diminishing of public housing, and diminishing of public works. And on April 11th, 1968, 7 days after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968. In Title VIII of this act, which was commonly referred to as the Fair Housing Act, provided, quote, fair housing to all persons regardless of race, color, religion, sex, or nationality, end quote. The FHA deemed activities such as refusing to rent, sell, or show homes and directing buyers to homes based on the buyer's race, color, religion, sex, or nationality illegal. While it deemed all those activities illegal, the FHA also criminalized advertisements that showed a preference to buyers or renters of a certain race or origin. Furthermore, the FHA also protected homebuyers from predatory home loan lenders. And this provided a lot of support to Black Baltimoreans within the city. Now, it didn't fix many of the problems from earlier discriminatory policies, but it provided some sort of protection. And in 2008, the FHA law would be put to the test when Black Baltimoreans once again suffered from predatory policies. This time, the policies came from the banks. Leading up to the 2008 Great Recession, banks purposely targeted people of color and Black neighborhoods with predatory loans. And when the housing bubble burst, thousands of Black Baltimoreans faced foreclosure they faced foreclosure, Baltimore became the first city to use the Fair Housing Act to sue a home loan lender, which was Wells Fargo. And they argued that Wells Fargo specifically targeted Black neighborhoods with subprime mortgages. In 2012, a judge ordered Wells Fargo to pay a settlement of $175 million. And following the successful suit of Baltimore, the city of Memphis and the United States also sued Wells Fargo. And so I want to end with an examination of the housing situation in Baltimore today. And here you can see two maps of the percent of residents, both Black and white in Baltimore. The map on the left is percent of Black/African-American residents, and on the right is percent of white residents. As you can see by this map, the policies of housing discrimination put in place in the early 1900s still affect Baltimore City today. White neighborhoods that introduce segregated housing policies and covenants are still primarily white today, and Black neighborhoods where the city forced Black residents with the racial policies are still primarily Black today. In Baltimore, this is known as the black butterfly and the white L, and is known by most who live in the city. And the housing discrimination and policies set in the 1900s affect Black Baltimoreans in a wide variety of ways today. In housing, the race-based policies still affect, for example, the percent and location of home ownership in the city and the number of liens that people in the city face. Yet this forced segregation and apartheid affects more than just housing. It affects the rate of poverty in the city. It affects the life expectancy in the city. It affects employment opportunities within the city, and it affects education within the city. Baltimore's housing segregation policies had wide-ranging effects on the Black community when they were set, but also set the stage for wide-scale poverty and social issues that you see in Baltimore today. I want to say thank you so much for joining the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to give a minute for people to ask questions. So this was a really great presentation, and a few months ago for Doors in Baltimore, we had Dr. Lawrence Brown give a talk based on his book, The Black Butterfly. He's the one who coined the Black Butterfly. And if you're interested in doing a deeper dive into some of these issues, I recommend tuning into that talk as well. It's on our YouTube channel. I think I shared the link to that presentation. So I'm going to go through with some of these questions, and I appreciate how much you were able to fit in 30 minutes from the 19th century all the way up to today. It was really well done. I think it's also just important that people know that this stuff is still going on, right? The Wells Fargo settlement happened only a few years ago, and we're still seeing, in the real estate market, when the value of Black homes still, clearly being valued less than white homes as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was a whole nother 30-minute presentation I could have found on how this also affects health, especially within these communities. And that's something really interesting as well as how housing affects health, especially the lack of proper housing.
Yes, and wealth generation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So one question that we have, and you're a historian here, so that I don't know if you have the answer to this one, but it's how do we change this, right? It's this has been going on for centuries. How does this change?
Yeah, it's hard to from the historian perspective, it's hard to answer that, but it really is addressing the not just equality but equity, making sure that you provide not just the same resources but resources that help those who are in negative situations or situations that were forced upon them, provide the resources to build them up. And I know there are a lot of institutions who are are working on this today. Baltimore City has a Department of Housing and Equity. I probably messed up the title, and I know they're working on it. But yeah, it's a lot of trying to put the resources where they're needed. And I will say, making sure people, one way to fix it is by presentations like these, where people learn about the history of it, and learn that there are long-lasting issues.
Yeah, and speaking, just following up with that question, someone has also asked if you know of any present or historical interventions that have been effective in reversing the impacts of structural racism.
I'm trying to think. I'm mostly just trying to think of Maryland history, because that's my specialty. I will say the FHA law did a decent amount. It didn't fix every problem, but it provided that barrier. There were organizations and activist organizations throughout the 1960s, during the main civil rights movement, who were pushing for fair housing and addressing these issues. The problem is, when a lot of these issues were being developed and when they were really kind of getting to the point of no return, and the individuals who could have made changes were opposed to it. And so it really does. So I don't know the exact answer to the question, but I know that there were individuals and groups who were trying, but it was really an uphill battle throughout history to try and fix these problems.
Yeah, and another question that we got is sort of like, it's not really a question, it's more of a statement to say that this presentation is important to educate us on the history and consequences. And it's scary to see what's happening in states like Florida and South Carolina, where they're trying to, ban this sort of history education. And I just wanted to hear more about like what the Maryland Center for History and Culture is doing, right? Because this is a great presentation. We'd love to learn more about your work at the center.
Yeah, so we're kind of taking on these topics and making them as present as possible. We're using our archives and a great oral history collection we have to start working on an exhibition that's going to open up in May, that looks at the activists of the civil rights movement in Maryland. But also, from the education side, we work very closely with Baltimore City schools, and presenting this history, but also present history throughout the entire state of Maryland. And so our goal and one of our roles is making sure this history is available and out there. And so, we've done a lot of research on this topic and used a lot of stuff within our collections to make sure that it is available and out there for people to find, and make those resources available for teachers and students through online learning curriculums and other kind of presentations that we give.
Great. And someone also asked about the role of the banks in supporting redlining. If you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, so I mean, the banks were that's where so Black families who went to try and get loans following the HOLC map, if they went to banks, the banks would reference that map, and if they were living in a neighborhood where it was redlined or graded D, the bank would not give loans, or give loans with very high interest. And so the banks are, supporting this system of housing discrimination that the HOLC map created. And so the fact that they're either giving loans with really high interest or not giving loans at all leads to the fact that, families who couldn't get loans were going to go back to renting, or families who did get loans were going to have very high interest, which could have also bankrupted them. So the banks are playing a major role in this. And you see that in 2008 as well, with the loans that Wells Fargo and these other banks are giving out, these subprime mortgage loans that are bankrupting and forcing individuals to leave their home and become homeless or go back to renting. And so, the banks were a part of this. They were part of the system. It's not just the private company. It's not just the private homeowners associations or the government. It's also the banks and loan organizations who are doing this, who are kind of making it worse.
Thanks. Someone had asked about finding a recording of this. It'll be on our YouTube channel. We'll be working on getting that up probably early next week. I'll put a link in the chat box here. But to wrap things up, Alex, I'd love to hear more about what's happening at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and here's your chance to give a pitch about any exhibitions or things that people might want to check out.
Yeah, so in May, we are, like I said, opening up an exhibition that looks at the civil rights movement in Maryland through the voices of the activists who led the civil rights movement. And this is allowing us to use our great oral history collection of these civil rights leaders and everyday people to hear the civil rights movement through their voice. But just like this presentation connected to today, the exhibit opening up in May is also connecting it to today as well by looking at the most recent civil rights protest, the George Floyd protest, and on also looking at what institutions and organizations are working to address problems. But we are open. You're more than welcome to come and visit. We welcome anyone to come in. We have some great exhibitions that look at all facets of Maryland history. We also are a research institution, so we have a library with over 7 million documents that in many of the images and documents that I showed today are available for research. So feel free to come in and research. I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has them in the future. My email is available on the website, but I'll just also throw it out there for anyone who wants it. It's Lothstein, Lothstein @mdhistory.org.
Thanks. And so I do want to include one more question because I think it's a really important one for just the context of this, which is how much did the Baltimore idea come to influence segregation policies across the country in the early 20th century, talking about the legalized segregation? Was it seen as a model?
Yeah, so the Baltimore idea was seen as a model throughout the United States and actually throughout the world. So there are records that individuals who were planning apartheid in South Africa actually came and studied the Baltimore plan to figure out how Baltimore did it. So this plan was studied, was copied by various cities throughout the United States, and the Kentucky law case was one of those cases where they instituted the Baltimore idea, and then then it was found unconstitutional. But by the time that happened, the Baltimore idea had been instituted in various cities and states throughout the Northeast and the South, leading to basically situations similar to Baltimore of the traditionally Black neighborhoods, traditionally white neighborhoods, where there's the wealth disparity between those two neighborhoods.
Yeah, and the policy got national news. Like the New York Times had covered it. And it was a really big deal across the country.
Yeah.
So great, Alex. We really appreciate you joining us today, and thank you for being our first virtual history of 2022. And again, you could find a recording of this virtual history and all of the other 70+ ones we've done over the past 2 years on our YouTube channel. And I hope you can join us in a couple weeks when we're talking with Richard Messick about his project to map slave trading sites in downtown Baltimore. So until then, thank you.
Thank you very much.